bit. We are very excited to continue our march through America from the 19th century to today, August 1st, 2024. So we are really in the tail end of the election season, and I'm so excited that we'll be able to do a deep dive. And instead of just asking for everybody's predictions, we'll really try to get some analysis as well. I'm proud to introduce Bruce Kane, who's a professor of political science and the director of the Lane Center for the Study of the American West. He has longstanding interests in American voting, democracy, and more recently, he wrote a book about climate change. Next to him is Brandis Keynes-Roane, who's a professor of political science and also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, where she runs a center on revitalizing American institutions. She's an amazing scholar of Congress and American political behavior. And Hakeem Jefferson, who's a professor in the political science department, a scholar of race, political attitudes, and American democracy and politics, and he runs a program on identity and justice at the CDDRL. They are wonderful colleagues, brilliant, and they are going to first start off by each providing us a little overview of what they're thinking about the election. I'll then open up some big questions to them before we start our Q&A. All right, so Bruce, take it away.
Okay, well, all three of us can talk about the specifics of what's been happening since January, but I thought I would put it in a context related to the broader issues of democratic design and save more specific things for a little bit later. So I want to say in all democracies, particularly in American democracy, there are three common tensions that come up all the time and have been around for at least the modern era of politics. And those three tensions are worse in some ways currently and are contributing to a political frustration about the system that I think is deeper than at any other time that I've been a political scientist. What are those three tensions? One is between different elements of the party, or the party coalition, if you like, between the base, the loyal base of the party, and swing voters and people that are going to ultimately decide the outcome, and between getting elected and governance, which is the one I worry about the most, that there's a tension there that I'll get into. And all of this, as I said, has resulted in what I would call a growing election accountability governance gap, which is the things that we do to get elected make it harder to govern, and vice versa. So I think this gap is something that we're struggling with in America. So one, the tension between the different components of the party. So way back when I was a young person, there was a distinction that was very common in political science between the party as elected officials, the party as organization, and the party and the electorate. And that distinction has been complexified at all levels. So the party as elected officials now, we elect more officials than ever, certainly more than we did 50 years ago at the state and local level. So when we talk about elected officials, it's a very dispersed group of elected officials, which have grown in number. Party as organization, back in the day when Bruce was young, which was a long time ago, it was the Republican and national committees and all the state and formal committees of the party. Now, that's just much more complex, and we have essentially now proto-parties, candidate committees, and other kinds of, essentially heavily connected independent spending groups. And so to say exactly what the party is as an organization and who makes the decisions about who is a candidate has become much more complex. And then lastly, the party and the electorate, which is not only the network of loyal voters and activists, but also the party network of donors and interest groups. So all three of these things have become more complex over the lifetime, at least of my lifetime as a political scientist. Now, in general, we used to say that the electeds and the organization represented the pragmatic power considerations of the party to a greater degree, and the various elements of the electorate, except for the sort of indifferent voters, were part of the sort of let's worry about issues, let's worry about ideology, et cetera. So they tended to be less about pragmatic power. And I think to some extent that's true, but I'm going to say that's changed in some ways because of political reform that we've undertaken in the last 50 years. So the introduction of primaries, the introduction of independent spending and campaign finance, preference for small donor democracy aided by the internet, et cetera, have weakened, and plus many other reforms, have weakened the party as organization, and particularly the party officials. And it's made the electeds, who used to be pragmatic, much more dependent on the party base and the donors. And I want to keep talking about the donors because the donors have a role in both of these campaigns in terms of understanding where we are. So, you know, and so the Republican Party is less ideologically and racially diverse than the Democratic Party. That means in the long run, they worry about their long-term future and they have to win through the Electoral College, not the popular vote. It has the advantage that it's easier to get everybody on the same page because they're much more uniformly conservative. And I have an article that's coming out in a book with David Brady where we look at the coalition over time, and the Republican coalition stays pretty white and Christian and, you know, and conservative. And Democratic Party is much more diverse, much more interesting, in my humble opinion. But that means it's harder to hold the coalition together. So what we got is a Trump coronation, which was somewhat obviously facilitated by his skill as a demagogue, but also by the fact that the party is not as complex. And so he was able to get his base consolidated very quickly, which led to real problems for the Democratic Party and caused the party to really panic and leading to the switch, the great switch between Biden and Harris. And a lot of that was orchestrated by donors, which annoys some younger idealists in the party.
So could be.
Yeah, okay. No, as a matter of fact, you're going to like the next part of what I say. In reality, a lot of it also has to do with the non-populist elected, and chief among that, I think, is the black leadership, which is by far the most pragmatic part of the party. So no, I wasn't looking at you, Hakeem, for that reason, just because you're so handsome, I had to look at you, no. All right, so second is the tension between base consolidation and November race. Now, these guys are going to probably mention this, so I won't go into it very much, other than to say Trump consolidated his base in his coronation of a convention, right? And he has the advantage that the Electoral College favors his base more than the Democratic base, because the Electoral College has gone back and forth in terms of which party has been favored over time, but right now it favors the Republicans because it's smaller states that have more rural, non-educated, white, they have whiter populations, et cetera. And so his appeal of grievance towards white people and Christians and others that have lost out in political power and social status and economic status has much more, if you like, of a natural constituency in some of these states that are competitive states, okay? And so there's a natural advantage there, but it's not, it's close enough that we can talk about this being a competitive race. And Harris, it's very clear, I've been spending time with the YouGov people and their data. It's very clear that what you're reading in the papers is correct, that Harris amazingly and quickly has consolidated the base of the Democratic Party. And partly that's because she improved a lot as a candidate. She, just like Clinton, people forgot, Clinton started out, he was miserable. His first speech he gave was terrible. But smart people learn, and Kamala has definitely learned. So, or Harris, I should say. I have to not train myself to use the first name of women because, well, for obvious reasons. Anyway, one thing that the Democrats have to be careful of is Trump is fact-free, which allows him to focus on narrative. We force-feed our candidates with facts, which means that they tend not to think about the narrative. And that killed, think of the 3 women that went before the Congress and couldn't remember why it's evil to, you know, go across the lines. Well, of course they know that the attack of Hamas across those lines and killing women and children, that part of it is evil, absolutely, okay? So, you know, but they couldn't articulate that because they were thinking of all the legal implications that they had been fed. So you see this in a lot of the Democratic candidates, that it's just, we got this back, we had this achievement, this bill, that bill, et cetera, but they didn't have a narrative as to why people should vote for them. So you know, so the last tension is the tension between getting elected and governance, and that's the one that I worry about the most. So both parties struggle with transforming the negative partisanship that gets them into office into some sort of, you know, cross-partisanship or ability to negotiate across party lines, that what you need to do in the American political system, because the way we designed it, there are too many veto points not to be negotiating. You can't, there are moments where you can get a consensus because you've been attacked like 9/11 or because for whatever reason you have a depression. But for the most part, we're a fractured country because we have lots of different, lots of variation out there across states, across race, across income, et cetera. And so you got to negotiate, and you got to take whatever you can get that history will give you at that moment in time. And the reality is the Democrats, you know, were able to be effective on passing the bipartisan infrastructure and the COVID bill, but they struggled on immigration. They definitely, and by the way they handled COVID, unfortunately, did contribute to inflation, and there's a residual effect of that. The Republicans have been in disarray about the Ukraine and can't even get their act together to pass a budget. So both parties struggle in the governance side. So it gets back to my last point here, which is there's always been a disconnect between electoral incentives and governance incentives. Always been there. We've talked about it in our field for many years. And you know, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose, you know, things like that. But it's gotten worse. And that's what really worries, I think, many of us in political science and election law, which is that the electoral strategy makes bipartisan negotiation and agreement much harder. I will add to that globalization and pandemics introduce another element, which is that out of the blue, you can get hit with an event that you don't expect. And that also creates this disconnect that you didn't get elected on that. You didn't really think about all that. And so, again, it undercuts the connection between democratic accountability, which is, we're gonna hold you responsible for what you did. Ironically, Trump was probably thrown out of office for COVID, but he may come back because of COVID, because of the inflation that was sort of part of the recovery process and left the cost of living high and affected the personal income of people. So he died by COVID. He may be resuscitated by COVID. So we'll see.
Oof. All right. Brandis.
Okay, so I thought I'd talk today just briefly about sort of, you know, we get a lot of questions, not just from the media and our colleagues, but, you know, from parents, from others. We're on the phone with, you know, how to think about predicting the election. And this is the time of year that we get all these models coming out. You know, we know how to predict. I thought I'd say a little bit about these models and how to kind of evaluate them in historical accuracy, and then talk a bit about the factors in this campaign that, you know, where you can kind of beat the trend, so to speak, and the ones that the candidates have control over, and say a bit about the specifics and save a bit more of the specifics to the Q&A as well, like Bruce said. So, you know, the kind of grandparent of these economic models, particularly the economic ones, is Ray Fair. Many of you may know this model. So he was early in on this, that you could basically predict the election with information that isn't candidate specific. That's what's really incredible about the claim when you think about it. It's as if Biden-Harris, almost not important. It's a little bit in his model because there's an incumbency term. So it switches just ever so slightly. And it's based on GDP growth in the election year, GDP growth across the term, inflation, as Bruce mentioned, across the term, president party's time in office. So I plugged it in. It's tricky because the third quarter usually matters a lot in these models. And as you know, yesterday was July 31st, so I couldn't get, you know, the definitive third quarter. And it predicts a 50-50, 49.73%. And it's I should note, it's not an electoral college model. It's, you know, Fair was a popular vote model. So it seems to have a little bit of a, I'll just note on the side, so it misses 4 of the last 11 since 1980. It does predict Trump in 2016, but it also predicts Trump in 2020. So it misses Biden's one of the misses. So you can take that for what it is. So Rayfair's model, as those, I know many of you looking at your biographies, work with models, you could say it's both a strength and a weakness. It sort of has this elegance of being sparse, so people have built on it. You've got all these models with state-level data, third-party candidates, gasoline prices, mortgage rates, you can plug a lot in. There's not a lot of, since 1980, there aren't a lot of presidential elections. So, the overfitting gets there. So we come in political science. We tend to think that candidates can do things and it's not only the economy. And so we start plugging in things like presidential approval. We can talk about polls in the Q&A, but we believe they have more merit than I think the public does at the moment. And also believe that there are, believe they have more merit within their confidence interval, and that there are real margins of error here, and that, I know all of you understand that, but that seems to get missed sometimes in the press, obviously, that when you're within 2 percentage points, you don't really have a prediction. You don't know. The poll is basically telling you, we really don't know who's going to win in that state. So these models, naturally, when you put in that candidate-specific information, they're better. They're better at predicting. But even there, in an election like this one, that's pretty tight. No one likes it when I say it's really too close to call at this point. People, want an answer. So I think this is where you get to those media. But my personal opinion, and not just my personal opinion, but looking at all the data, whether it's poll data, whether it's the fundamentals, this is really too close to call. So what do the candidates have control over? And that's where we see, a very evolving election, given the, given that we now have something, much more, you might say much more normal. We always hear about how other countries manage to hold an election, in 8 weeks or 12 weeks, and we're going to actually have to do that for once. So you see the candidates fighting. The standard in political science is that you want to both emphasize the issues that favor you and try to de-emphasize the issues, that don't. And so it's interesting to watch in real time. It was clear that the Biden and now Harris campaign were going to emphasize abortion and, of course, threats to democracy, and January 6th. And they've been doing that, and that Trump would emphasize immigration, and which shows up as the #1 most important issue in most of the polling in the United States. Right now, and then the economy. It's always tricky. In some ways, the economy is always #1 because it gets there are a lot of different economic factors, and they get, but inflation being the big one right now. Historically, candidates move to the middle, in the general, but consistent with some of Bruce's comments, there is less of that over time, because candidates are both trying to raise money, since they're forgoing the public funds that they could receive, because you can't, the lesson in the 2000s was it was a disadvantage to accept those funds, and you could raise much more. But when you raise money, a lot of research, including some of my own, the people who donate tend to be more extreme. And so if you're too moderate, you may be missing out on, and particularly with the rise of the internet and the small donations that came from internet fundraising, you're missing out on a large chunk of funding. And in addition, there's been a move with micro-targeting to the get out the vote efforts, which of course also tend to be, you want to get out the vote that you're confident in terms of the vote. I actually thought it was interesting. I read that Trump is making a major effort to register young men. And it's true that Trump is doing better with young men than he had been doing, and that but I mean, this is I think it's an interesting and risky effort, because it's not as if, well, Trump is just killing the youth vote or something like that. But he's obviously a pretty inexperienced candidate, so you may get some some experiments here. But typically, you're trying to turn out your core. And then you want to get out, consistent with Bruce, the advertising that often is very negative. The evidence, and no one likes to hear this, and I'll just note that my dad, who has no expertise in politics, was telling me I'm definitively wrong on this. And this is after, having been in the field for, decades now. All of the evidence suggests that, the bounces from the convention, the vice presidential picks, they matter almost nothing. The vice president gets you 2 percentage points in your home state, a little bit of a regional effect. Now, you could say in a close election, right, that's the 2000 election. That could have been the 2004 election. So I don't want to say it's never pivotal. But the focus on it from the press tends to not match the evidence. I do think that this election is potentially different. So that's where I'll say that it could matter more than, I do think from even what evidence we have, it could really matter more than usual. Because Vice President Harris is not someone, right, who came up through the primary. So voters are really still evolving their opinions of her in a way that is uncommon, right? She's the first candidate to not come up through the primaries since the McGovern-Fraser reforms, right? Fraser-McGovern, sorry. Reforms, which moved us from the parties. It used to be, right, up through the early 70s that candidates were selected by the actual party, consistent with Bruce's comment, the delegates at the convention, right? And then there was a move to have the delegates pledge to the winners of the primary elections in the states. So I actually think one of the interesting consequences is that if Harris wins, you will see efforts by the parties. Right, because one reason they moved was the pressure from below in the Democratic case and the dissatisfaction in the 1968 convention. But the Republicans followed because they saw that this could lead to more electorally appealing Democratic candidates being selected, even if it meant that they were more difficult for governing, consistent with Bruce's comments. So if it turns out that the more electorally appealing candidate is actually selected from, since there is a groundswell of fundraising, but ultimately Vice President Harris was selected from the elite, right? I mean, she was selected from above, and she beats Trump. I think you'll see a move from both parties to try to move in and have more control over the selection process in future years. And I think you may see some of that. I mean, the fact that she's outperforming Biden, even if there's a kind of narrow victory for Trump, I think you could see much of that. Where does this leave us today? We have a, as I mentioned, very tight race based on the fundamentals, more volatile than usual. So that's what I will grant, given the newness of Vice President Harris. I do think it'll be interesting, someone who loves studying politics, obviously, to see if the campaign events that usually don't matter, that I'll kind of grant my dad and that they may matter more this year. And I think, that's one of the fun things. And so that we'll get to observe in real time.
Awesome. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Brandis. Thank you all for coming to listen to us share some of our thoughts about what is a crazy election. I mean, it's so crazy that in the comments that have been made so far, we haven't even mentioned that the former president of the United States survived an assassination attempt.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, this American politics has been crazy, and crazy is a technical word, crazy for a while. But I think we're all in sort of uncharted territory. And so you'll forgive us if the things that we say here don't bear out. I think we're all figuring it out as we go, but I think Brandis's comments and Bruce's comments really remind us that as crazy as this moment seems to be, political scientists have been thinking about this sort of thing for a long time. And one of the mainstays in American politics, which won't surprise any of you who paid attention, is that race and identity have long mattered in structuring outcomes in American elections. So no Democratic candidate for the presidency has gotten a majority of the white vote since Lyndon Johnson. That's a little before my time, Bruce, a little before my time. And black Americans have long been just, as a set of scholars call them, steadfast supporters of the Democratic Party. And so there are many different factions that divide governments and politics and the places from which you come. And in the United States, there is no parallel to race as a sort of central organizing feature of how people come to think about and make political decisions. Of course, this differs issue by issues where other identities might come to matter slightly more, but in structuring outcomes and elections, we sort of know how these different identity factions, when they come to race, will pair out. There have been some comparative politics scholars who have called the Republican Party, using comparative politics language, an ethnic party. It's a party that does the bidding, the argument goes, of its white voter base. As Bruce noted, the Republican Party remains an overwhelmingly white political party, though there are some interesting tensions that are happening in American politics, where we see small but meaningful, I think, moves of some people of color to the Republican Party, despite the rhetoric of Donald Trump. And so I think one of the things that's really striking is that you see, again, small movements. Scholars are still debating how big these movements are, of Latino men, for example, showcasing stronger support for Donald Trump. And on the margins, I've looked at this recently, on the margins you see some small share of black men who seem to be at least enticed by Donald Trump. And Dee Dee noted at the start that there's some questions about this, and the honest answer is we don't know why this is. There's some theories of the case that the sort of economic downturns that these communities of color have experienced have been particularly acute for men of color, such that they feel compelled to look at an alternative option in Donald Trump. Some theories of the case is that it's the machismo and the sort of masculine performance that Donald Trump brings to bear that is attractive to some men of color. Some arguments are that the sort of bootstrap mentality that Donald Trump and the Republican Party espouses is gendered in such a way that it's more attractive to men, the bootstrap mentality being that you pull yourself up, you work hard, that can have some sort of gendered notions as well. But the honest truth is that we haven't quite figured that out yet. But in November, I don't make predictions, that's not my job, but I can say this, that the vast majority of black voters will vote for the Democratic candidate for president, Kamala Harris, and it is unlikely that Kamala Harris will get a majority of the white vote. Those are predictions that I'm pretty comfortable making, and I think those are ones that we can take to the bank. But I want to zoom out just a little bit to make some notes about American politics beyond this election cycle, having gotten those comments out of the way. I think many of us on the panel would agree that American democracy is at this sort of unique inflection point. That the parties differ certainly on policies, policies that Bruce and Brandis know much more about than I do. But there is also another great tension that divides these two parties, which I think is more consequential than their differences on various policy questions. And that's on their investment in the idea of American democracy and multiracial democracy in particular. And we all know about January the 6th and the events of that day. Of course, we saw this white mob of Americans who stormed the Capitol to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. And I think what's really interesting and noteworthy about that moment is that it reminds us of how central race is to the question and problem of democracy in the United States. And so those folks who on January the 6th stormed the Capitol did so in part because they had been convinced that it was a stolen election. But all the data and the aftermath of January the 6th, and when we look at sort of what predicts support for that movement and those efforts, et cetera, is that race and racial attitudes are at the core of what guides those folks to support that violent storming of the Capitol. And so in the days after, as many folks were talking about polarization and misinformation, others of us were trying to remind folks that this represented what is this critical frustration for some white Americans in the country today, which is this perception that white Americans are losing power and status. And there's this crowd, this sort of multiracial crowd, getting what they don't deserve, occupying seats of power that white Americans are presumably entitled to. And Donald Trump is interesting, not just because he's Donald Trump, but because he is an avatar for this kind of politics of grievance, this kind of politics that suggests that these folks are cutting the line, they're getting stuff that actually you should be getting. And this is a kind of politics I think that we've seen throughout the course of American history. But there really is a friend from grad school and a scholar of white identity politics called "This is a Moment of White Identity Politics." And I think that's one of the real interesting things to see, that we see these dominant identities really being marshaled in service of a kind of a political operation. And so Donald Trump and the Republican Party of today, more successfully, I'd say, than campaigns and parties in recent history, have figured out a way to really marshal a kind of white grievance politics. And so you can see it and hear it in the rhetoric of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. You can hear it in the rhetoric of now Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance, who was chosen in part because Donald Trump believed that he could articulate this kind of politics of the left behind, having written this award-winning book that I have not read, Hillbilly Elegy.
Me neither. I'm proud of that.
I have not. I'm proud of that as well. Yeah. So there's this politics of grievance that is occupying the right in this moment, and it's a politics of grievance that poses real problems for American democracy. Yeah. And so we've seen, for example, attempts to burden the vote across the country in places where minorities are overwhelmingly the voters at issue. And we've seen other attempts. In the 2020 election, for example, we saw that the Republican Party focused on jurisdictions, questioning the vote in jurisdictions where minority voters were overwhelmingly the voters who voted in those jurisdictions. And so you saw in a place like Michigan, where the Republican Party of Michigan said that we'll certify the votes in all these other jurisdictions, but not in the county in which Detroit, Michigan is seated. And so we see these tensions playing out in real time, and we'll see it in this election as well. Let me say something about Kamala Harris, since she was in the news a bit yesterday.
Yeah.
So if you missed it, there was conversation yesterday by Donald Trump about whether Kamala Harris is a black woman. And I couldn't let this opportunity pass because the social construction of social categories is something that I think a lot about, and have actually written a paper with our colleague Lauren Davenport, thinking about how it is people construct racial categories in mind. And so I'll just note that, one, yes, racial categories are socially constructed. Donald Trump wasn't making that point. That we can think about how it is people come to belong to racial categories in the U.S. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But what is Donald Trump doing?
Yeah.
And calling into question whether Kamala Harris is a black woman or not. So it's interesting, if you know anything about the history of race in the U.S., it used to be the case that to have what we'd regard as one drop of black blood, the one drop rule, would render one black, right? Because racial categories are socially and politically constructed. And so it was advantageous historically to construct outside the boundaries of whiteness black people. So why is there this seeming reversal? Why would it now be the case, this mixed race woman who identifies as black, why would an anti-egalitarian person put more or less technically a person who might be a bit racist? Why would he not want this woman to be rendered as black? So we've seen this sort of reconstruction, this attempt to reconstruct racial boundaries in ways that are politically advantageous, right? And so to set Kamala Harris outside the boundaries of blackness is to have an attempt to weaken a racial coalition one believes is disadvantageous for one like Donald Trump. That is to say that to render Kamala as less black is an attempt by Trump, in part, I think, to weaken support for her among black voters, to say that she is in fact not one of you, which is a hard case to make given what we've seen in recent days, large black support for Kamala Harris. But it is also to play the kind of racial games that Donald Trump is known for. He called into question Barack Obama's authenticity as an American, is calling into question Kamala Harris's authenticity as a black American. And so maybe I'll end just by noting that as crazy as that is, yesterday was a crazy day for a scholar of race. As crazy as it is a part of a playbook that the Republican Party in particular brings out when their backs are against the wall, and they play this kind of race card that they often accuse Democrats of playing. But I'm happy to talk more about that and all the other crazy bits on race in the Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Those were amazing comments. There's a lot to discuss, but I just wanted to ask for the first question to anyone who would like to discuss it. What are the important things we should be looking for? Not just what Brandis's, we know what Brandis's dad thinks matters, but like, what are some things that we should be looking for in the run-up to the election? What do you expect to see? And what are kind of the stakes? Like, what do we think happens if Kamala Harris wins and versus if Donald Trump wins?
You mean it wins the whole election?
The whole election.
Oh. Well, all right, I'll go first. I think there's a lot at stake in policy, and so it's kind of worrisome that so much of the discussion about the election so far doesn't really focus on anything related to policy. Yeah. And we're going to get sidetracked on the damnedest things. You know, some of them are real issues, like, you know, if you read the 2025 report that they have, I mean, they do take up the issue of tariffs, and you got to think through very seriously these questions of how much do you protect industries, how exposed do you want to be to, you know, imports, things like that. You know, how much do you do for job development? What degree do you put it into retraining for people? How do you prepare them for automation? All these really important issues, and nobody's talking about them at all, really. I mean, because we get sidetracked on exactly some of the stuff Hakeem was talking about. It's sort of the politics of distraction. And so if you look at, you know, the issues, yes, the top two issues are inflation and immigration. And immigration definitely, we have to confront the fact that immigration now is much more about refugee status. We're not ready to process refugees, as many of the OECD nations weren't ready for all of them. And so we don't really have a good way of figuring out who has legitimate claims. We don't have enough administrative officers to process all these people. Again, that should be what the conversation's about, but that's not. It's being, you know, essentially polarized in the conversation. So there's a lot at stake. And so I guess the question is, I have to ask myself, would it improve the prospects of coming to some constructive answer to have more conversation during the election? Maybe not, I don't. Maybe it's better that we're distracted on side issues, and maybe that leaves the space open. I don't know, but I find it very frustrating, and I suspect that what I anticipate is that you know, it's going to be very hard for Kamala Harris and the Democrats to really get the conversation, you know, onto a narrative. What is it you're telling the people that you need to persuade in these, you know, 6 or 7 states that have in fact suffered deindustrialization, automation, now AI, which will affect all of us at some point? What is it that we're saying? Do we have something? I mean, I think the IRA tried to do that. It tried to, you know, put jobs, green jobs into brownfields, but that, it turns out that a lot, you know, once you put those turbines up, there aren't a lot of jobs involved in them. And even mining, by the way, was losing jobs simply because it's much more automated. So, you know, we all have to come to grips with, there are huge economic changes that are going to have effects on what the Marxists used to call social and economic relations. And so,
I think we're talking a little bit about those issues. I mean,
yeah.
The UAW the trade union just endorsed Kamala Harris. I think surrogates for the campaign are talking about some of these issues. I actually think it is quite useful to hear a candidate for president espouse views that indicate where, that reinforce the indications of where he's going to be on a host of social issues like race. For example, the Supreme Court is another thing at stake, and Brandis can certainly say much more about that. But I mean, this is an election that will certainly, I think, decide how the court looks for probably the rest of some people's lifetimes, including my own for a lot of it. And I think that's a really high stakes outcome of this election. And I mean, it's not just in national politics where these sort of outcomes matter, but we know that local politics and state politics is increasingly nationalized, following the kinds of directions of national politics. And we've seen at the local and state levels a lot of attempts to create these sorts of divisions and the like on the basis of race. And so I think some of these are distractions, and Donald Trump is a master of the distraction. But I just wanted to note that I think it's useful for the country to be reminded of really what is at stake in terms of race and the like when we hear Donald Trump espouse these rather absurd views that remind us of where he stands, I think, on a host of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so I think if Trump wins, one of the largest effects will be on the federal federal bureaucracy, and agencies. So I think we should take him at his word that he really wants to reshape the way that agency appointments work. It may not be as extreme as the 2025, report. I think that would be kind of hard to actually implement just with the without having massive majorities in Congress. But you can do a lot from the executive alone, and I think he intends to do it. I hear from my colleagues who work in the more security and international areas that he has a particular gripe with the CIA. There's a kind of personal vengeance part of it with Trump, which seems pretty believable that this would be the sort of person that he does a good job of imitating the type of person who would have that kind of personality. So whether in the end, he does that, it's so directed at the CIA specifically, but I certainly think we wouldn't expect just more of the same on the federal bureaucracy. Yeah. What is interesting about Trump is that on some policies, of course, he is trying to move the Republicans to the middle, right? Social Security, Medicare. He it seems like he sort of fell into the presidency by accident, but obviously he had people advising him and did seem to know what some policies would definitively make him lose if he went out. And it is with sort of the coalition he's put together. And we saw an abortion, while he certainly appointed quite conservative Supreme Court justices, he's now leaving it, the kind of, there is a group of Republicans who would like to have a very national influence on abortion in the more conservative direction, and he has, I think, for electoral reasons, and I will go out on a limb and say perhaps for personal reasons as well, not wanted to move away from that and leave it to the states. I think that with a Harris administration, it's quite interesting to think about. She has a really tough time. So I'm going to slightly disagree with Bruce. I'm not sure that the Democrats, on the one hand, you might say there's certainly policy issues over which the Democrats have an advantage on the Republicans. At the same time, she's in a tough position. She's been a part of the Biden administration, so she can't attack Biden too much. Yeah. And she's released these ads that show her as a tough on crime prosecutor in these swing states where they should play well, but she doesn't want to be too far, this is the tension I mentioned in my comments, that she wants to turn out the base, she wants to excite the donors, she doesn't want to go too far to the middle. So I think there's certain policy issues she will want to talk about, and then there's kind of others where again, the tension is not just with, it's kind of even more complicated than your typical one, given her.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the word you said.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
we're
great.
on the same page.
She did not run as a tough on crime.
No,
Yeah.
in the Democratic primary.
And the Democratic primary. It was a different time when she was vying the last time. And it's, just as an aside, I think so interesting to watch how much, it's the third line out of her mouth these days. That, she was.
Well, one thing you have to understand is that she is unusual for a Democratic candidate in the sense that her path was completely on the legal side. I mean, she started out in the DA's office. She became, attorney general, and so she's never had legislative or executive experience. And so what she understands the best is sort of the prosecution side. So I think it was also an element of comfort for her.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It turns out to be the right framing for the particular candidate she's running against. As she says, she knows the type.
I will note that a few of the vice presidential candidates that are being considered, they all know each other through a network of being attorneys generals of their states. So I'm going to ask, I see that there are already some questions. I'm going to just ask one more question to them, and then we will open it up. So the question I have is about the other elections happening in November. What do you think of the elections for Congress, for the Senate and the House? I think the Democrats have a tough map in the Senate, and as we know, it's razor-thin margins in both chambers, but also any down ballot races at the state level. And also ballot initiatives. Is there anything that you all can speak to that's also, something we should be looking out for prior to November?
Well, I haven't really started analyzing the ballot measures, so I want to hold off on that. I do think there is this phenomenon that we haven't quite figured out yet, which is why the Democrats are doing so well in some of the Senate races that are in swing states, and whether it was just a matter of the discrepancy between the types of candidates that were running in the Senate races versus Biden. He was genuinely perceived by 70% of the electorate to not be mentally and physically capable to do the job. And now there seems to be, a better enthusiasm about a younger candidate. So I think the Senate races are looking surprisingly strong at the moment. And it may be because, the Republicans have made some mistakes by putting some really, really extremist people there. And the Democratic Party, for all their problems, have always figured out that, you got to run somebody that's more tailored to the state. Just as, the trick in California, it's not surprising me that Kamala came up with this from that background, because the trick in California is not the blue state that everybody depicts it as. It's a light blue state. It's had more Republican governors than Democratic governors in its history, including in the post-war period, okay? So it's a light blue state. So the politicians in California have figured out that if you're going to run somebody in the Central Valley or in Southern California, you've got to assure the voters on certain things. And so we've run an enormous number of policemen and, you know, people that were attorney generals, et cetera. So that sort of signaling was a Willie Brown invention that really made a big difference. And so she comes out of a tradition of picking people that have a profession that assures somebody that you're not a radical. And I think that's what's going on here with Kamala.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the switch to Harris has really helped the Democrats on the down ballot. So I think that that's why it was such a dominant strategy, that hopefully she wins, but if she doesn't win, the down ballot races go much better than they were going to. So
That's great.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think they're exactly right.
And the House may be closer too, we just don't know. Particularly, that's where I think the Harris, if she does have a kind of a Barack charisma, and it's too early to tell right now, but if she does, then there could be some positive coattails, and it's possible that the Democrats could get control of the House, which could matter, by the way, if for whatever reason neither candidate gets you know, a majority of the Electoral College, then the House, it's thrown to the House that's elected. So there's a lot at stake in the House race as well.
That's right. All right.